Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am reviewing another entry in the medieval Craftsmen series that I've been reading and enjoying. This one is called Armourers and this is what the cover looks like. This series takes a skill or a job or an occupation that was in the Middle Ages and discusses them in about 100 pages to give the reader a good overview, and this is Armourers. So those who create armor, those who create the chainmail or the plate armor that was used in the Middle Ages when waging war. So I felt like this book was really interesting. It was definitely a standout in the medieval Craftsmen series, particularly because of the amount of interesting examples that were shown, and I'm going to show you a lot of examples of the armor in the book as I talk about it, but this book was really enjoyable and I had a great time reading. So I'm going to discuss what was in this book to give you an overview of what was covered, and then I'm going to talk about things that I enjoyed about this book. So, medieval craftsmen, armorers. So this is a history of those who made armor, and there is a focus in this book on Italy and Germany. So those are the two main centers in continental Europe for making armor. The focus of the series is on Western Europe in the Middle Ages, so they're not talking about things that were happening in other parts of the world, so there is that narrow focus. And in this book in particular, most of the focus is on Italy and Germany because we have good documentation of the people who worked there, and that's where centers of excellence were established in Europe. It's not to say that there were not masters working in other countries, and they are kind of touched on: Flanders, France, England, but those were the points of focus for this book. And this book discusses chainmail, full plate armor all the way up to about 1650, and we're going to discuss why. And I viewed this book as in two separate parts, even though the table of contents divides it into about 5 parts. There's one which is all about the history, the guilds, the community, so the people doing the work, and then the second part of the book is about the process, how to actually create the armor. So depending on where your interests lie, you may find one part of the book more interesting than the other. I in particular found the history, guilds, communities, the people who are doing this work more interesting than the second half of the book, but I think the beautiful photographs of the armor throughout the book kept me interested the entire way. So armor in the Middle Ages actually didn't evolve for a long time because chainmail was sufficient. And the book does talk in the process section about how chainmail was created, but chainmail was sufficient for a lot of things that were happening in warfare. However, things became an arms race, quite literally, when there became an increasing power behind distance weapons. So longbow and crossbows were able to start penetrating mail armor, and so there became this race between the armorers to protect their people who were wearing their armor versus the people who were responsible for outputting power on weapons like crossbows and longbows. And this led to the development of full plate armor, which would protect someone in a way that mail couldn't. So mail was susceptible to being punched through by a crossbow, where plate armor could negate that. So that's how plate armor came into effect, and that initially it worked, but then there was the development of firearms. And when firearms came onto the scene, they became more and more powerful, and the plate armor kept trying to keep up, but it reached a point where the plate actually became too heavy and uncomfortable to wear in battle. And so at that point, the plate armor has kind of lost to firearms, although mail actually continued to be used for a little while longer because it still provided protection against glancing blows and from not long distance weapons, while still being lightweight and flexible and comfortable more or less to wear. So that is the history of what happened and why around 1650 we have this emergence of firearms, and the plate armor just would have to be too heavy to protect someone from the firearms and therefore be too unwieldy to be worn into battle. So that's this arms race that occurred throughout, and we have good documentation, and the book focuses on what happened during that changing from mail to the plate armor, and then at the descent or the lack of focus, or how it fell out of favor when firearms came into the picture. I think that this ties in with another book I read by Ian Mortimer called Medieval Horizons, which talks about things that changed during the Middle Ages that had a massive impact. And one of those things he talks about is guns, the advent of firearms, and the advent of also other like heavy, strong projectile weapons. So that'd be like increasing crossbow strength, but also things like cannons really changed the nature of warfare. And we moved away from this knight fighting knight swords, and that had implications on a large section of society, including armorers, which eventually would no longer be a field. There's no one who is employed making armor today, or if there are, it's in a historical context or for props for movies, or very niche context. It's not something that all of us have, just some armor lying around, and it's not a job most people have. So the advent of guns really did change a lot. In this section, the authors also talk about guilds, the guild structures, the different rules, and some specific centers, including Augsburg and Nuremberg in Germany. The author talks a lot about how Nuremberg was highly specialized, and to be recognized as a master, you couldn't just present an item of armor to the guild to be judged and brought to the master level. You had to produce one for each item you wanted to create. So if you wanted to create helmets, you'd have to create a helmet. And then you could only produce helmets. Everything else was off limits until you produced one of those items to be brought to the master level. So Nuremberg was highly specialized. Milan was another center, but that, when we read about that, seems to be more flexible in the rules and the guild structure, and due to that flexibility, it seemed to succeed in ways that other places in Germany didn't. But that is not to say Germany didn't succeed. It also was recognized as a center of excellence, but Milan seemed to be very, very excellent in creating this armor, and the people who came out of that system were highly sought after in all of Europe. And finally, there's a discussion about the wealth of the people who made this. If you could become a master at your craft, if you're creating these fantastic pieces of armor, I'll show you a couple more here, you could command high prices, and these people were very, very wealthy, and they were able, in some cases, when the rulers would be in debt to them, were able to do things like become part of the landed class, or in other ways, curry favor with people, because the government, the people in charge, owed them so much money for these beautiful, beautiful, intricate pieces of armor that were created. And it's just absolutely fascinating to look at all these and think about the handiwork and the skill that went into crafting a piece like this. The second half is truly the process of making it, and I think what's interesting about this section is, well, there's a function to a lot of this armor. There is parade armor, there is joust armor, there's also armor that's truly meant to be worn to protect someone in battle, and it is a blend of function and art. So there truly is art in this, and the art is absolutely fantastic. The art of what these pieces were created. I mean, you just have to appreciate the skill in these, but there's also supposed to be a function, and everything plays a part in these pieces. So I think that blend is what makes it so interesting. And also the amount of photography in this book, just absolutely fascinating. I love it. There's plenty of beautiful examples throughout this book, and in this last section there is also pictures from different works at the time explaining and recreating how these things were created. In some cases we are not entirely sure, but they're doing their best to recreate how armor was created. Here we have some chainmail examples, and these are more from texts or manuscripts at the time that we're pulling it from, and we can also look at the final product and see what we can learn about. There's a whole section in here as well about the temperature that this metal needed to be heated to, and the different ways that the people working this metal would be able to tell, which I always find very, very fascinating, that today we know we need to heat this to 310 Celsius, and then we need to put it in water immediately. Like, we have these processes if you were to learn this craft today, just for fun or for historical reenactment or whatever you're learning it for, and we can control things like the temperature quite easily. We take it for granted. If I want to go, I don't know, make banana bread this afternoon, I can just push some buttons on my oven and it's going to heat it to more or less the temperature that I set it to. But a medieval craftsman wouldn't have that luxury, so they developed a wide range of techniques to determine how hot an oven was, and one of them was heating a little piece of metal to check the color. But otherwise they were just kind of, I would say guessing, but you would have to think that someone would develop a skill, an innate understanding of how hot a fire could be. But it was just an interesting thing that was touched on in the process, that something we take for granted is something that they really had to think about back in the Middle Ages. And finally, in this process section, there was a lot of tie-in with the work the goldsmiths were doing. And I actually have the Medieval Craftsman Goldsmith book, but I have not read it yet. But if I have to imagine there is a tie-in with that goldsmith book because of the amount of gold that was put on some of these pieces of armor. Here's an example right here that those two groups would probably work closely together. So overall, this is a super fun book. I, again, wanted to just look at these over and over. I felt like I was kind of indulging my inner child here, looking at all these knights. They're an intriguing and fascinating part of history that is no longer there, but I feel like they still do quite a good job capturing the imagination. We can think of the number of times that knights appear in like fantasy even today. So this was a very interesting book, and I think everyone is going to be able to take away something from this book. At the very least, you can appreciate the absolutely fantastic artwork that was put out by these medieval craftsmen in building this armor for people. And I highly recommend checking out Armourers if you've enjoyed the Medieval Craftsmen series. And if you want to check out other books, I have a whole lot of other books on this Medieval Craftsmen series that I'm going to put into a playlist for you to easily access. And you should also check out Medieval Horizons by Ian Mortimer, which discusses many things that changed during the Middle Ages. I think some of that touched on in this book, but Ian Mortimer has a fantastic audiobook that I listened to, which discusses things like, for example, guns, which changed a lot of things on the scene in the Middle Ages. Please leave your thoughts and comments, as always, in the comment section down below. I love to receive them. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.